In December of 1882, in Wyoming's Wind River Range, the first snow fell early and heavy. By mid-October, homesteaders were already splitting wood like their lives depended on it. Because they did. Everyone knew the rule. You needed 4 cords minimum to survive a Wyoming winter, maybe 5 if the season turned mean. But there was a problem nobody talked about much. A problem that killed fires, wasted effort, and left families shivering even when they had wood stacked to the rafters. Wet firewood. You could split it until your hands bled, stack it neat and tight, but when November rain turned to sleet, when snow piled 3 feet high and then melted during a Chinook wind, your wood got wet. And wet wood doesn't burn. It smokes, it hisses, and it robs heat instead of giving it. Most men just accepted it. That's winter. You split more, you burn more, you suffer through it. But one man didn't accept it. His name was Ever Whitmore, and in the fall of 1881, he dug a hole beneath his house that made the whole valley think he'd lost his mind. Before we go further, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe, because every week on this channel, I bring you real survival techniques from the American frontier. Techniques that actually worked when comfort wasn't optional. It was survival. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. I want to know if you're dealing with wet firewood right now, or if you've got your own tricks for keeping it dry. Now, let's talk about what Ever built. He wasn't a genius or an engineer. He was a carpenter from Pennsylvania who'd come west in '78 with his wife, Margaret, and their 2 young boys. He built a solid cabin, but he had a problem that gnawed at him every winter. His firewood storage was a mess. Like everyone else, he stacked his wood under a lean-to roof. It worked fine in dry cold, but Wyoming gives you freeze-thaw cycles. It gives you rain that turns to ice. It gives you snow that melts and refreezes, locking your woodpile into a single, frozen, soggy mass. Ever spent half his winter mornings prying apart frozen logs, trying to find pieces dry enough to catch. Even when he got a fire going, the wet wood would choke it out with steam. His chimney clogged, his family breathed smoke, and the math was brutal. Wet wood burns at maybe 60% efficiency compared to dry. He was burning almost twice as much wood just to get the same heat. So in the summer of 1881, Ever made a decision that baffled his neighbors. He was going to dig a cellar, not for vegetables, but for firewood. Not beside the house, but beneath it. He planned to excavate a chamber directly under the main room, accessible by a trapdoor in the kitchen floor, with a second entrance on the downhill side for loading. The underground space would stay dry, stable, and protected. The earth itself would insulate the wood from freeze-thaw cycles. To Ever, it made perfect sense. To everyone else, it sounded insane. You're going to dig under your own foundation. His neighbor Jacob Pruitt asked. Not under the foundation, Ever said, offset by 2 feet. Jacob just shook his head. You're asking for a collapse, or a flood, or both. Margaret didn't say much, but Ever could see the worry in her eyes. Still, she trusted him. By late August, Ever was waist-deep in the earth beneath his home, hauling out buckets of clay and rock. The chamber measured roughly 8 feet wide, 12 feet long, and 6 feet high, enough room for 3 cords of split wood. The whole valley heard about it, and the whole valley thought Ever Whitmore had gone mad. Let's talk about what Ever actually built, because the engineering here is smarter than it looks. It wasn't just a hole. It was a carefully designed thermal and hydrological system. First, the excavation. He dug down roughly 5 feet below the cabin floor, choosing a spot where the natural grade sloped away from the house, ensuring any water would flow downhill. The floor of the chamber wasn't dirt. It was a 6-inch bed of coarse gravel. This created a French drain effect. Water could percolate down and move away from the structure. No standing water, no mud. The walls were a combination of dry stack stone and split logs, with deliberate gaps left between the upper logs for ventilation, just wide enough to allow air circulation without letting in rain or snow. Now, here's the critical part, the chamber's connection to the house. Ever cut a trapdoor in the kitchen floor. When closed, it was nearly airtight. When open, you could climb down and grab an armload of wood without ever stepping outside. But he didn't stop there. On the downhill side, he dug a sloped tunnel that emerged outside the house about 15 feet away. This was the loading entrance. In autumn, Ever could split wood and stack it underground without tracking mud or snow through his kitchen. The system was elegant. Underground, the temperature stays remarkably stable, hovering between 45 and 55 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to prevent rot but warm enough to keep wood from freezing. More importantly, the humidity remains low. In Ever's chamber, The gravel floor drained liquid water away, while ventilation ports allowed water vapor to escape. The result was a microclimate perfectly suited to keeping wood dry, even when the surface world was drowning and Ever finished the chamber in early September 1881. By the first hard frost, he had 2.5 cords underground, accessible day or night. His neighbors watched, shook their heads, and waited for it all to fail. Daniel Calhoun was the man people listened to about building in the valley. He'd been there since '74 and knew stone and timber like some men know scripture. In late September, Calhoun stopped by to see the shelter for himself. He stood at the edge of the tunnel and finally said, "Whitmore, I've seen men try clever things before. Most of them end badly." Eva replied, "It's sound, Daniel. The drainage works." Calhoun wasn't convinced. "You wait until spring melt, all that snowpack is going to turn to water, and is going to find the weakest point, which is going to be your hole. Your whole cellar will be a mud pit." Word spread fast. The story of Everswood's cellar became a running joke. Men at the trading post grinned when his name came up. Jacob Pruitt was blunt. "You're going to flood your foundation. Ever. Don't come asking to borrow my timber to rebuild." Daniel Calhoun said it best. Whitmore's gamble isn't with his firewood, it's with his family's shelter. And that's not a gamble a smart man takes. Nobody argued. Winter was coming, and everyone would see who was right. The first snow of November 1881 was light. Ever split a few more cords, filling the underground chamber nearly to the ceiling. By mid-November, he was done. 3 cords, bone dry, waiting in the dark beneath his kitchen. Then December hit. The temperature dropped fast. Snow fell in waves 8 inches one night, 12 the next. Then a brief thaw turned everything to slush before the cold locked it down again. This was the freeze-thaw cycle every homesteader dreaded. It started on December 18th. A warm Chinook wind blew down from the mountains. Snow turned wet and heavy. Roofs groaned. Tops sagged, and every woodpile in the valley started absorbing water like a sponge. By nightfall, the wind shifted. Arctic air poured back in, and by morning, the wet snow was frozen solid. Jacob Pruitt's woodpile became a single frozen mass. He spent an hour with a maul just to break loose enough logs for a morning fire. Half of them were too wet to catch. The other half burned with thick, choking smoke. Daniel Calhoun's wood fared a little better, but even his driest pieces were damp. He burned through a full cord in 3 weeks, twice his normal rate, because wetwood just doesn't produce heat. All across the valley, the same story played out. Fires that should have lasted 6 hours burned out in 3. Chimneys clogged with creosote. Men split wood in the freezing cold, only to find the inside of the logs damp. Children slept in coats because the house never got warm enough. And then, the real test came. On January 9th, 1882, a storm moved in that people in the Popo-Aggie Valley would talk about for the next 20 years. It snowed for 4 straight days. 3 feet of snow fell in the first 72 hours, with drifts piling 8 feet high against the north walls of cabins. The wind was relentless, ripping tarps off wood piles, scattering kindling, and burying everything under a white, suffocating blanket. When the storm finally broke, the temperature plunged to 22 below zero. People burned furniture. They burned fence rails. They burned anything that would catch because their firewood was either buried, frozen, or soaked through. But inside his cabin, Caleb Whitmore simply opened a trapdoor in his kitchen floor, climbed down a short ladder, and pulled up an armload of split pine. It was as dry as bone. The underground chamber he had built, the one his neighbors had mocked, had stayed at a steady 48 degrees the entire time. No snow had entered. No moisture had seeped in. The ventilation ports had circulated fresh air without letting in a single snowflake. The gravel floor had drained away the tiny bit of condensation that formed where warm air met cold earth. Caleb lit his fire with a single match. It caught immediately, burned clean, and held steady for 8 hours. His wife, Margaret, stood at the stove, warming her hands. She didn't say a word, but she looked at her husband with something close to awe. Outside, the valley was suffering. Inside, the Whitmore home was warm, and the neighbors were starting to notice. If you're still watching, stay with me, because what happened next didn't just prove Caleb right. It changed the way people built homes in that valley for the next 50 years. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what's the coldest winter you've ever lived through. I'll see you in the next part. By late January 1882, the difference was impossible to ignore. Jacob Pruitt had burned through 4.5 cords of wood in just 2 months. Daniel Calhoun had gone through nearly 4. Most families were rationing what little they had left, desperately splitting green wood and trying to get a fire going with pitch-soaked rags. Caleb Whitmore, on the other hand, had burned just 1¼ cords. Let that sink in for a moment. Same valley, same weather, same size homes, more or less, but Caleb was using less than 1/3 of the wood his neighbors were consuming. The reason was simple: efficiency. When you burn wet wood, you're not just losing heat up the chimney, you're re-spending a huge amount of energy just boiling off the moisture before the wood can even start to burn properly. A piece of firewood with 25% moisture content, which is what most outdoor wood was at after all the freezing and thawing, requires about 1100 BTUs per pound just to drive off the water. That's energy that should be warming your house. Caleb's wood, stored underground at a stable temperature and low humidity, averaged around 12% moisture. That's nearly dried. When he put a log in his stove, it caught fast, burned hot, and produced almost no creosote. His chimney stayed clean. His fire radiated steady, even heat. He could load the stove at bedtime and wake up to glowing red coals at dawn. His neighbors were waking up to cold ash and starting all over again every single morning. But it wasn't just the fuel savings, it was the temperature inside the house. In early February, a traveling surveyor named William Hendricks stopped at both the Whitmore and Pute cabins on the same afternoon. He was carrying a mercury thermometer, an expensive instrument at the time, and he recorded the interior temperatures just out of curiosity. At Jacob Pute's cabin, with a fire roaring in the stone fireplace, it was 58 degrees. At Caleb Whitmore's cabin, with just a moderate fire in a similar fireplace, it was 68 degrees. 10 degrees warmer with less wood. Hendricks mentioned this at the trading post a few days later, and the story spread like wildfire. 10 degrees might not sound like much, but it's the difference between sleeping under 2 blankets or 4. It's the difference between frost forming on the inside of your windows or staying clear, between your water bucket freezing solid overnight or staying liquid. And here's the other thing nobody had anticipated. Caleb's wood supply was still growing. Because his underground chamber stayed dry and stable, Caleb could continue splitting and storing wood throughout the winter. Most men couldn't do that. Their outdoor piles were frozen solid or buried under snow. But Caleb could work on a mild day, split half a cord, and carry it through the tunnel to his storage without worrying about the next storm. By March, when his neighbors were scraping together their last stockpiles and eyeing their fence posts, Caleb still had 1.5 cords underground, dry and ready. Daniel Calhoun saw it with his own eyes. He'd stopped by in late February, supposedly to borrow a saw, but really to see if the underground shelter had flooded during the spring melt. The temperature had climbed into the 40s for 3 straight days. Snow was melting everywhere, turning the ground into a soupy mess. Caleb opened the trapdoor and invited Calhoun to look. The chamber was bone dry. The gravel floor had absorbed and drained away the minor seepage. The walls were solid, and the woodpile looked like it had been stacked yesterday. No mold, no rot, no moisture. Calhoun stood there, staring down into the chamber, and finally said the words Caleb had been waiting months to hear. "I'll be damned." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. The math didn't lie. Caleb's system worked, and it worked better than anything else in the valley. Let's look at the breakdown, as best as records and oral history can tell us. The average wood consumption per household at winter was 4 cords. Caleb Whitmore's consumption was 1.5 cords. That's a 64% savings. The average interior temperature during that February survey was between 56 and 60 degrees. The Whitmore cabin was 68 degrees. That's an 8 to 12 degree advantage. The time spent retrieving firewood daily from outdoor piles, 15 to 25 minutes in harsh weather. Caleb's retrieval time, 2 minutes, through an indoor trapdoor. The convenience factor, immeasurable. And then there was the spring melt test, the one Daniel Calhoun had warned would destroy everything. It didn't. The drainage system worked exactly as designed. Snowmelt percolated through the gravel bed, flowed downhill through the natural grade, and exited through the shallow ditch Caleb had dug. No flooding, no foundation shift, no structural damage. The underground wood shelter had survived its first winter. It had proven that sometimes the craziest ideas are just the ones nobody else has the courage to try. Spring of 1882 brought the questions. Men started showing up at Caleb's door, asking to see his underground chamber. Not to criticize this time, but to learn. Jacob Pute was the first. He walked over one April morning, hat in hand, and said, "I'd like to see how you built that tunnel entrance, the one that doesn't let snow in." Caleb showed him, explaining the slope, the low door, and how he de-angled the opening to face southeast so drifting snow would pass over it rather than pile against it. By June, Pute was digging his own chamber, smaller than Caleb's, but built on the same principles: gravel floor, ventilation, downhill drainage, and a trapdoor into his kitchen. Daniel Calhoun held out longer. Pride, maybe, but by the fall of 1882, even he was asking Caleb for advice on foundation offsets and moisture barriers. Within 3 years, 17 homesteads within 50 miles had incorporated some version of Caleb's design. Not all were identical. Some built simpler root cellars close to the house. Others went all in, excavating full underground chambers with interior access. A few even combined it with root vegetable storage, creating dual-purpose cellars. But the principle spread because it worked. By the 1890s, the Whitmore method, though nobody called it that, officially had become standard practice for homesteaders in high elevation, freeze-prone regions across Wyoming, Montana, and Colorado. You can still find remnants of these shelters today if you know where to look. Collapsed stone walls, overgrown tunnel entrances, and gravel beds that refuse to grow anything because the drainage is still that good. Even after 140 years, this technique didn't just save wood, it saved lives. Families with dry firewood had fewer respiratory illnesses from smoke. They burned fewer green logs, which meant less creosote and fewer chimney fires. Their homes stayed warmer, reducing cases of frostbite and hypothermia. Children slept better. Wives didn't spend half the winter coughing. Men weren't exhausted from prying apart frozen wood piles every morning. And here's the deeper lesson, one that applies whether you're living in 1882 or today. The best survival solutions aren't always the loudest or most popular. Caleb Whitmore didn't invent underground storage. People have used root cellars for centuries. But he applied an old principle to a new problem, and he had the guts to do it even when the so-called experts told him he was wrong. He didn't argue with them. He didn't waste energy defending his idea. He just built it, tested it, and let the results speak. That's the frontier way. If this story taught you something, if it made you think differently about how our ancestors solved problems with nothing but stone, timber, and common sense, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. Thanks for watching.